The morning sun spilled over the rooftops of Prosperity Creek, Wyoming territory, turning the dusty Main Street into a river of gold. Charlotte May Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, her fingertips resting against the cool glass as she watched the town stir awake. Wagons creaked past, merchants unlocked their shops, and a group of cowboys laughed loudly outside the saloon. It was another ordinary morning in the frontier town, but for Charlotte, it felt like the beginning of her end. At 19, she was everything a frontier lady was expected to be: refined, well-mannered, and beautiful. Her father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, had made sure of that. He'd hired tutors from the East, bought her silk dresses from San Francisco, and raised her to uphold the family's reputation. On the surface, she was perfect. But inside, Charlotte longed for something more. She wanted freedom, adventure, love, the kind that couldn't be bought or arranged. Her mother's voice shattered the quiet. "Charlotte, Samuel Hartley will be here within the hour. Put on your blue silk dress. You know it brings out your eyes." Charlotte froze. Samuel Hartley. The name alone made her stomach twist. He was the son of the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man whose fortune could buy half the territory, but not a drop of decency. His breath always smelled of whiskey, and his hands wandered too freely. Yet her parents saw him as the perfect match, a union of wealth and power. "I'd rather wear sackcloth," she muttered under her breath, but she dressed anyway. The blue silk felt like a cage, beautiful but suffocating. Downstairs, the voices of men drifted in through the parlor doors. Samuel's father, Martin Hartley, was speaking loudly to Judge Whitmore. "The wedding could be by Christmas," he boomed. "My boy's eager to settle down, and your Charlotte's of age. No sense in waiting." Charlotte's jaw clenched. They were deciding her future without her, as if she were cattle being traded. The walls of her father's grand house felt suddenly small, the air thick with the scent of cigar smoke and arrogance. When she finally entered the parlor, all eyes turned to her. Samuel's face lit up in a way that made her skin crawl. He stood, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and bowed slightly. "Miss Charlotte," he said, pressing his lips to her hand, "you're looking mighty lovely today." "Mr. Hartley," she replied, withdrawing her hand as quickly as manners allowed. They sat, and for the next hour, Charlotte endured Samuel's bragging. He talked of his ranch, his cattle, his plans for expansion, and the sons she would bear him, as if her life were already written, her choices already stolen. Her mother smiled approvingly at every word, and her father nodded along like a man sealing a profitable deal. Then Samuel stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. Perhaps Miss Charlotte would enjoy a walk in the garden. It was expected. She was supposed to smile, take his arm, and pretend to be flattered. Instead, Charlotte stayed seated. "Actually, Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice steady, "there's something I must say." The room fell silent. Her mother's face drained of color. "Charlotte," she hissed, "don't." Charlotte stood anyway. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Hartley, but I must decline your proposal. I will not marry you." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's face flushed dark red, his father sputtered, and her own father's expression turned to stone. "Charlotte May Whitmore," Judge Whitmore said slowly, his tone like ice. "You will apologize, now." "No, Father," she said, her chin high. "I will not apologize for wanting to choose my own life." "You foolish girl," her father snapped. "You have no choice. You are my daughter, living under my roof, eating my food. You will marry whom I say." "Then I'll leave your roof," Charlotte said, though her hands trembled. Her father's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You'll regret that. If you won't marry Samuel Hartley, then by my authority as circuit judge, I'll see to it you marry someone who will teach you humility." Her mother gasped. "Harrison, no." "I mean it," he said. "She'll be married within the week to the first unmarried man who'll have her, be he beggar, drunkard, or servant. Let her see what freedom costs." Quote. Charlotte felt her world collapse around her. She had wanted to escape one prison, but she'd just been sentenced to another. Her father stormed from the room, and the sound of his pen scratching in his study soon followed, writing the public notice that would seal her fate. By morning, the whole town knew. The judge's proud daughter was to be married off to whoever answered the call. Some laughed behind her back, others pitied her. But no one dared challenge the judge's decree. Days passed, each one slower and heavier than the last. Drifters came, tempted by the offer of a wife and the judge's small dowry, but none were approved. Her father turned away every man until, finally, one name was chosen. Thomas Becket, a stable hand from the livery. Charlotte remembered him only vaguely. Quiet. Always respectful. A man who worked hard but kept to himself. He wasn't cruel or foolish, just ordinary. A servant, as her father intended. The morning of the wedding, Charlotte stood before the mirror in a plain gray dress. Her reflection looked like a stranger's. Gone was the proud judge's daughter, replaced by a girl about to be handed to a man she barely knew. Thomas Becket, her mother said bitterly as she adjusted the veil. Your father has truly lost his mind. A servant. At least he's not a drunkard, Charlotte whispered, trying to believe her own words. The church bells rang, calling her to her fate. The small Methodist church was half full. Neighbors come to witness the judge's daughter's humiliation. At the altar stood Thomas Becket, clean-shaven and dressed in a borrowed suit that strained across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, his green eyes fixed on the floor. He looked as nervous as she felt. The ceremony was short and joyless. The minister's voice droned through the vows, and when it came time to kiss the bride, Thomas simply bowed his head and pressed a gentle kiss to her hand. No one clapped. No one smiled. Her father handed Thomas a small purse. That's her dowry, he said coldly. She's your responsibility now. And just like that, it was done. Charlotte May Whitmore, daughter of a powerful judge, was now Mrs. Thomas Becket, wife to a servant. As they climbed into the wagon that would take her away from everything she'd ever known, Charlotte looked back once at her father's grand house. Then she turned her face toward the open prairie, where a small cabin waited, and a future she could neither predict nor escape. The wagon rattled over the uneven dirt road, each jolt reminding Charlotte how far she'd fallen from her father's grand home. The wind tugged at her veil, carrying with it the smell of sage and dry grass. She sat stiffly beside Thomas, hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to look at him for too long. Thomas drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins. The only sounds were the creak of the wheels and the mule's slow, rhythmic snorts. Charlotte couldn't help glancing at him from the corner of her eye. His clothes were plain, patched at the elbows. His skin was sunburned from long days outdoors. Yet there was a quiet strength about him, a calm steadiness that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. After nearly an hour, Thomas spoke, his voice low and rough. It's not much where I live, but it's clean and the roof don't leak. You'll be safe there. Charlotte only nodded, not trusting herself to speak. When they reached his homestead, she saw a small cabin tucked between two cottonwoods. It was humble, built from rough timber, but it stood solid against the wind. A few chickens pecked in the yard, and a small garden grew behind the house. Thomas climbed down first and offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his calloused palm. His touch was careful, almost shy as he helped her down. This is home, he said quietly. Charlotte looked around. The entire cabin could have fit inside her father's parlor. Yet it was tidy, every surface swept, the windows washed, wildflowers in a small jar on the table inside. You cleaned for me, she said without thinking. Thomas looked away, a faint color rising in his cheeks. Seemed only right. He set her trunk near the bed and stepped back awkwardly. You can have the bedroom. I'll sleep up in the loft. Quote, the loft? Charlotte frowned. But we're married. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed gentle. Only on paper, ma'am. I know you didn't choose this. I won't take what ain't freely given. I'll sleep up there till you say otherwise. Charlotte blinked, surprised. Her father had promised her humiliation. Instead, the man she was supposed to fear was giving her space, respect, and a choice. That night, after supper, she lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the creak of the cabin, the soft rustle of wind through dry grass, and above her, Thomas's slow breathing in the loft. For the first time since the wedding, she didn't feel afraid, only curious. The next morning, the smell of coffee woke her. Thomas was already outside, chopping wood. He looked up when she stepped onto the porch, the early light catching his dark hair and green eyes. "Mornin', Mrs. Beckett," he said. "Charlotte," she corrected before she could stop herself. He nodded once. "Charlotte, then." He left a note beside her cup, at the stable, back by noon. His handwriting was rough but careful, each letter made with effort. She smiled, despite herself. Later that day he returned to find her fighting with the wood stove, her face flushed with frustration. "It's got a temperament," he said from the doorway, amused. "You have to sweet-talk it some." "I don't know how," she admitted. "Then let me show you." He moved beside her, adjusting the damper until the fire caught properly. Charlotte could smell the faint scent of horses and pine on him. His hands were scarred but gentle, his movements precise. "I can manage," she said, embarrassed. "I know you can," he replied simply. "But there's no shame in learning." They ate lunch together, bread, cheese, and cold meat. It was plain food, but Charlotte found herself hungrier than she'd been in days. Afterward, Thomas cleared his throat. "I need to ask you something." She looked up. "Yes." "Can you read and write?" The question startled her. "Of course I can." "I figured as much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Would you maybe teach me proper? I can sign my name, but it takes me near 10 minutes to write a note. I'd pay you somehow, fix things up, build whatever you need." Charlotte stared at him. "You want me to teach you?" He nodded. "A man who can't read is always at someone else's mercy, can't check if he's being cheated, can't read the good book for himself. I've wanted to learn my whole life, but no one ever had time to teach me." Her heart softened. "I'll teach you," she said quietly, "and you won't pay me anything. We're partners now, aren't we?" Thomas smiled then, a small, genuine smile that changed his whole face. For the first time, Charlotte saw how handsome he was beneath the dust and humility. That evening, after chores, they sat by the fire with a slate and a stub of chalk. Charlotte wrote A, and Thomas copied it clumsily. "A is for apple," she said. "A's for axe," he replied, grinning. "More use out here than apples." She laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. They worked through the alphabet together, Thomas turning every letter into something from his world. B for barn, C for cattle, D for dust. "You're a quick learner," Charlotte said when he managed to write his full name for the first time. "Got a good teacher," he said, looking at her in a way that made her chest tighten. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm settled between them. Mornings spent working, evenings learning by firelight. He taught her how to tell when a storm was coming by watching the clouds, how to find wild herbs by smell, how to mend a fence with rope and patience. She taught him words and numbers, history and poetry. One night he carved a small wooden box from scrap oak and placed it on the table. "For your letters," he said shyly, "so you have something fine of your own." Charlotte ran her fingers over the smooth surface, tracing the carved wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He shrugged. "Just something to pass the time." But Charlotte knew better. Every line, every carving had been made with care. She felt warmth rise in her chest, a feeling she hadn't known since childhood. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Thomas move quietly in the loft above, Charlotte realized something had changed. Her fear had faded, replaced by something gentler, something dangerous. Respect, and perhaps, just beneath it, the first stirrings of affection. She closed her eyes and smiled faintly in the dark, her father's cruel decree echoing in her mind. He had meant to break her, but the man she'd been forced to marry was teaching her what strength truly looked like. Winter came early that year, sweeping across the Wyoming plains with biting winds and heavy snow. The little cabin creaked under the weight of frost, but inside, it was warm. The fire burned bright in the hearth, and Charlotte sat by it, her hands folded in her lap as she watched Thomas at the table, tracing letters on a scrap of paper by lamplight. His brows were furrowed in concentration, his lips moving softly as he sounded out the words. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. He read slowly, each word careful and sure. Charlotte smiled. You read it perfectly. Thomas looked up, his green eyes bright with pride. Didn't think I'd ever be able to read a whole sentence straight through. You've worked hard, she said softly. You should be proud. He shrugged, but his smile didn't fade. Couldn't have done it without you. In the months since their wedding, life had changed in ways Charlotte never expected. What began as punishment had turned into partnership. Each evening they shared lessons, stories, laughter, and slowly, something deeper began to grow between them. One night, Thomas gave her another gift, a small wooden box carved with prairie flowers. For your letters, he said shyly. You deserve something pretty. Charlotte ran her hand over the smooth wood. It's beautiful, she whispered. You made this? Quote. He nodded, color rising in his cheeks. Winter nights get long, gives a man time to think. She smiled softly. You think a lot, Thomas Beckett. Only about things that matter, he said, his gaze meeting hers for a heartbeat too long. As the snow deepened outside, the two of them fell into an easy rhythm. They chopped wood, cooked simple meals, and read by firelight. He learned his letters, she learned the ways of the prairie. He taught her how to read animal tracks in the snow and where to find water in frozen earth. She taught him to read poetry, and sometimes he'd repeat her favorite lines under his breath while working, rough hands moving with surprising gentleness as he whispered words of love written by men long dead. Then came the storm. It struck without warning one January night, the wind howling like wolves outside their cabin. Thomas had gone to town that morning for supplies and hadn't returned. Charlotte tried to stay calm, feeding the fire, praying he'd found shelter. But as hours passed and the blizzard grew fiercer, fear clawed at her chest. When the door finally burst open near midnight, snow swirled in with the freezing wind, and Thomas stumbled inside, covered in ice. Thank God, Charlotte cried, rushing to him. She pulled off his soaked coat and boots, her hands trembling. I thought... I'm all right, he said, voice shaking. Got caught in the whiteout near the livery. Couldn't see my own hand. Sit, she ordered, guiding him to the chair by the fire. You'll freeze. He didn't protest as she wrapped him in every blanket they owned and rubbed his hands to bring the warmth back. His lips were blue, his breath shallow, but slowly, color returned to his cheeks. When his eyes met hers again, the look in them made her breath catch. Not just gratitude, but something raw and unguarded. Charlotte, he said quietly, you shouldn't have waited up like that. I wouldn't have wanted you worrying. I couldn't do anything else, she whispered. He smiled faintly. You've got a strong heart. She held his gaze. So do you. That night, after he'd fallen asleep by the fire, she covered him gently with another quilt and sat watching him. The flickering light cast shadows across his face, the lines of a man who had worked hard all his life, but still carried a kind soul. In that moment, she realized she didn't just respect him anymore. She cared for him deeply. The next weeks were hard. Food grew scarce. The winter was long and unforgiving, but Thomas never complained. When Charlotte gave him her portion one night, pretending she wasn't hungry, he caught her wrist gently. Don't, he said. We share everything, remember? But you've been working harder, she protested. He shook his head. We work together. That's how it is. Charlotte's eyes stung. No one had ever spoken to her that way, with equality, not authority. In the midst of that harsh winter, something beautiful began to take root. One evening, after they'd helped a neighboring family through the cold by sharing their few remaining supplies, Thomas returned from chopping wood and found Charlotte sitting by the fire with tears in her eyes. What's wrong? He asked, kneeling beside her. Nothing's wrong, she said softly. I just realized I've never been happier. He frowned, confused, happy. Out here, with me? With you, she said firmly. Exactly here. He stared at her, unable to find words. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. Charlotte, you were never meant for a life like this. I don't want to keep you from more than I can give. You've given me everything that matters, she said. Respect, kindness, a choice. He swallowed hard. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, she whispered. Thomas stood, pacing before the fire like a man at war with himself. When we married, I promised I wouldn't touch you till you wanted me to. I meant that. But every night, lying up there in that loft, I think about you, about what it would mean if you ever looked at me the way I look at you. Charlotte rose too, her heart pounding, then stopped wondering. He turned, eyes wide. Charlotte? She stepped closer, her voice steady. You gave me a choice. This is it. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the fire crackling between them. Then Thomas crossed the space in 2 strides, his hand trembling as he cupped her cheek. You sure? He whispered. She nodded. I've never been surer of anything. The kiss came soft at first, tentative, almost reverent. Then it deepened, pulling years of loneliness and longing into one perfect moment. When he finally drew back, his breath was uneven. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Charlotte smiled through tears. Maybe we both deserved each other all along. That night, for the first time, Thomas didn't climb to the loft. He stayed beside her. Their union wasn't hurried or desperate, but tender, an unspoken promise made in the quiet glow of the fire. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the window, falling across tangled blankets and the man beside her. Thomas stirred and smiled sleepily. No more loft, she said, half whisper, half laugh. No more loft, he agreed. From that day on, their marriage changed. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was love, real and simple and strong as the land they lived on. Together, they built something lasting. A small school for local children, a place where Thomas taught practical skills and Charlotte taught letters and books. People who had once pitied her now looked up to her. They said she and Thomas had something rare, a love that grew from respect, not wealth. And sometimes, when the prairie wind howled outside and the firelight flickered across the walls, Charlotte would rest her head on Thomas's shoulder and think of her father's cruel decree. He had meant to punish her. Instead, he had given her the greatest gift of her life. Because the servant she'd been forced to marry had become her partner, her best friend, her true home. And every night in his arms, she remembered that freedom wasn't something given. It was something chosen.